Hey everyone, how's it going? I hope you're all doing well today. I hope you're all staying safe. So, about a week ago, I posted a build about damage over time and I talked about the ridiculous damage that I got. And I wanted to post a guide because I've had a couple people ask me how it works and, if I can do a guide on it. So, I decided, yeah, you know what, that's a really good idea. So, I wanted to put out this guide for you guys. So, damage over time, or DOT for short, is basically stuff like poison, bleed, burn, sometimes freeze, sometimes slow down, and the enemy, if you inflict a status on it, what'll end up happening is that over time, their health is going to dwindle. So let's say, for example, you have a throwing knife, and the throwing knife inflicts bleed on an enemy. So because of that bleed, their health is going to slowly dwindle away. And so with damage over time, you're making the most out of weapons and skills and things like that, and mutations as well, that'll allow for the enemy's health to dwindle away. And then you can actually focus on things like either parrying or dodging or running away, just different things like that. So you get a lot of versatility when it comes to dot builds. Dot is also very crucial in high level gameplay in more subtle ways, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So dot builds can be both brutality and tactics. I will talk about the brutality mostly, but I will mention a little bit of tactics here and there. So with that, leave a like, subscribe for more Dead Cells, and enjoy the guide, everybody. So first up is the Hokuto's Bow. And the Hokuto's Bow is pretty much the central part of dot builds. It drops from the Cannibal, which is the white and purplish enemy that's found in the graveyard, and they're found in the clock tower as well. So what it is that it's a ranged weapon that when you hit an enemy, it'll set a mark of 75 DPS. When you kill that enemy, that mark spreads in an area of effect, and all enemies that fall within that mark will also be inflicted for 20 seconds. The enemy is also inflicted for 20 seconds. So with the Hokuto's Bow, the reason it's so critical to dot builds is because it actually synergizes with all the other weapons such as carbine and throwing knife, things like that. Because it also scales with status damages. So stuff like the poison from carbine, for example, if you hit a Hokuto's Bow and then a carbine, then the health will dwindle away a lot more quickly. Or if you use like a fire grenade, things like that. Hokuto's Bow scales with the status that you're inflicting on an enemy. Other affixes that you can get on Hokuto's Bow are stuff like shots explode into toxic clouds, poisons the enemy, and shots leave a trail of flames. All of these actually end up making Hokuto's Bow incredibly strong, especially the shots explode into toxic clouds, because what ends up happening is that you can just shoot an enemy and a toxic cloud is created, and you can end up clearing mobs out just by shooting one Hokuto's Bow. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that you don't end up having that, it pairs really well with all the other weapons and skills that we're about to cover. So what works with the Hokuto's Bow in order to get dot rolling? So Alchemic Carbine is one of the best weapons in dot builds. And what Alchemic Carbine is that it's a ranged weapon that you can get from the Ancient Sewers. And basically what it does is that it's a ranged weapon that once you hit an enemy, it'll poison them. So it's like a toxic cloud that's created when it actually hits the enemy. And so what ends up happening is it will poison the enemy and whatever mob it's in, because it's a big toxic cloud. And you shoot your Hokuto's Bow and then the carbine, and then the poison damage will stack over time. There are other affixes that you can get on the carbine, such as shots leave a trail of flames and things like that give you additional synergy. There's also things such as 60% to bleed, 30% to burn, those affixes, and you can actually pair those with your skills as well. So that's something that's really, really cool when it comes to the carbine, is that it's so versatile that you can actually make this a central part of your dot build. Next up is the throwing knife, and the throwing knife is something that is always unlocked. It is the kunai ranged weapon. It's typically used as like a form of synergy, so you can hit an enemy, get that bleed, and then something with 60% to bleed, or like a hemorrhage or something like that, and you can start to get a lot of damage off. But with dot builds, one thing that's really good about the throwing knife is that because it's so quick, you can get a lot of them off on a particular enemy, and especially if you have something like Shots Pierce, and the Hokuto's Bow has the Shots Pierce affixes, then you can actually clear out mobs pretty much instantly. There's a lot of really cool affixes that come with the throwing knife. There's shots leave a trail of flames, shots explode into toxic clouds, bleeding causes poisoning, and actually there's another one called bleed spreads to nearby enemies, and that's called bleed propagation. So what bleed propagation basically is that when an enemy dies that you've thrown that throwing knife to, and it has that affix, nearby enemies and surrounding platforms will also be inflicted with bleed. So with a Hokuto's bow, if you shoot the Hokuto's bow and the throwing knife with that particular affix, whoever falls within the mark of the Hokuto's bow, because it's an area of effect as soon as the enemy dies, they will also get the Hokuto's bow mark and the bleed, and they're probably going to end up dying as well. So that's something really cool that comes with the throwing knife. Bleeding causes poisoning is really good. Shots explode into toxic clouds. Shots leave a trail of flames. They're all really, really good when it comes to the throwing knife. But those are rare affixes. And generally, what you want is something like ammo +3 or something like that in order to just make sure that your ammo count is pretty good. Another good thing about the throwing knife is that it tracks enemies, which means that stuff like kamikazes, buzz cutters, things like that, you can actually just fire them willy-nilly. You don't have to go out of your way to hit them, because stuff like the throwing knife, magic missiles, blowgun, etc., they will actually target the nearest enemy. And with the throwing knife, you can take care of flying enemies much more easily. So that's something really, really good about it. Next up is the firebrands, and the firebrands, like the throwing knife, is always unlocked, and usually you would use it again just like the throwing knife for that 30% to burn affix and just get some nice little synergy going on. But you can also use it in dot builds as well, although it's not quite as good as the alchemic carbine and throwing knife, but hey, sometimes you got to work with what you got. So firebrands is definitely an option that you can have. It burns the enemies and the ground for 19 DPS for 3 seconds. And if you hit an enemy straight on, they'll be burning. If you hit the ground, then the ground's going to be burning. And keep in mind that this does not work in water, so you will just get the hit off the enemy if you throw it in water. It doesn't work. So make sure that when you have an enemy in a dot build and you want to run fire, make sure that you can take them outside. On 4 and 5 BC, you can do this by aggroing them with your head or by stomping on the ground near them, and then you can go to a nearby platform. 0 to 3 BC, find a different way to kill them. Don't make your entire dot build based on fire, because in water that can be a little bit tricky sometimes if you want to kill every enemy. Obviously, in 0 to 3 BC, since enemies don't teleport towards you, you can actually just run away and you don't have to fight them at all. And you don't have to put yourself in that position as well. But yeah, firebrands is a decent thing for dot build, but I wouldn't exactly recommend it. The Fire Blast is a really good ranged weapon that drops from the Masker. And for those of you who don't know what the Masker is, they're the enemies that kind of mask and fog the entire area so you can't see stuff. They're generally found in the, I believe they're found in the graveyard. They are also found in the prison depths, and they're found in 1 or 2 other levels that is escaping my mind. They're found in Sanctuary as well. So you kill them, and there's a 1.7% chance that you'll be getting the Fire Blast. And the Fire Blast is a consistent fire damage output. And basically, you hit an enemy, and you'll get critical hits with the Fire Blast if you have oil present. So you can get oil from a myriad of things. A lot of ranged weapons can give you oil. A lot of melee weapons can give you oil. There's also something called the oil grenade, and I actually have a guide to oil in my guide playlist, so you can check that out. I'll leave a card up above so you guys can check that out after this video. So with the Hokuto's bow, you can also get an affix that spreads inflammable oil, but if you don't, you can always just get the Fire Blast off, and you can pretty much smoke entire mobs, you can smoke bosses, and you'll more or less get something that can spread inflammable oil, especially if you have plus or plus plus or S gear. You'll end up getting something with inflammable oil. And there's 2 main fire weapons that you can use in dot, the Fire Blast and the Pyrotechnics. I like the Fire Blast personally because it's more consistent with the damage, whereas the Pyrotechnics is not, and that's also pure tactics, whereas Fire Blast, you can do both red and purple. So it's just up to you what you prefer. I'll go over the Pyrotechnics next, but if your dot build is going to be Brutality, then Fire Blast is always a good option to have. The Pyrotechnics is a really good weapon, and it's tactics only. It drops from the casters, which are found exclusively in the Slumbering Sanctuary, so you can get to the Sanctuary either through the Concierge if you have the Spider Rune, or you can go through Conjunctivius, and that's actually where you get the Spider Rune, funny enough, if you haven't been there yet. So definitely try to get the Pyrotechnics as soon as you can. It's similar to the Fire Blast. You get critical damage if the target is covered in oil, and again with the Hokuto's Bow, you can get that inflammable oil affix. Also, it can be paired with the oil grenade, which is now part tactics. You can get a lot of things that spread oil, honestly, like even turrets and things like that also get the oil affix. So Pyrotechnics is something that's really good. It's more of a damage type of weapon instead of damage over time, but I would feel remiss if I didn't include it because of the fact that it does get fire to it. And you do get burn on the enemies. The only thing is that it's a 4-hit combination, and if you just hold down the button, you'll be able to get all 4 hits. And the first 3 are just normal, and you get like minimal fire stacks, and the 4th one is a big explosion that gets a lot of fire stacks. So if you get that with oil, especially against bosses like Conjunctivius or the Concierge or the Timekeeper or Hand of the King, things like that, then you should be able to get the entire ground filled up with flames, double those fire stacks because oil and fire doubles the fire stacks, and you should be able to get a lot of really, really good hits off with the Pyrotechnics. But beware that because this is only tactics, if you're going to do a dot build with the Hokuto's Bow, you do get a lot of damage off, but you have to focus a lot on rolling and dodging attacks because tactics is very, very squishy in terms of your health. So just be on the lookout for that. Now we move on to the Blood Sword, which in my opinion is a very underrated weapon. It's probably the first blueprint you're going to be able to unlock, either that or the Spartan Sandals. They drop from the zombies, which are found pretty much everywhere, but on 0 BC they're found in the prison depths, the prisoner quarters, but they're also in the prison depths on 0 BC. But yeah, so the Blood Sword will cause bleeding to the target that you hit, and it doesn't do a lot of damage, but it stacks the bleed, so you get 9 DPS for 6 seconds. With the bleeding, that's base DPS, so that increases the longer that you go, the better weapons that you get. So with the Hokuto's Bow, not only do you get an increase on the damage on the Blood Sword, you get an increase on the blood as well, so you end up actually killing enemies very, very, very quickly. Legendary Blood Swords actually can get the 60% on bleeding target affix, which means that you can hit an enemy and then you get that 60% to bleed right afterwards. It's really, really cool. I'm a big, big fan of the Blood Sword, especially in dot builds. And while it isn't what many would consider to be part of a dot build, it's still technically a part of the dot build because of the fact that its main role is to inflict bleed onto enemies. You can also, like the throwing knives, get something called bleed propagation, which again is nearby enemies will bleed. So pair that with the Hokuto's Bow, and again, entire maps are pretty much decimated just by the fact that you kill one enemy with a Blood Sword. In that run that I have, the one that I mentioned earlier about dot builds, you can actually see that with the Blood Sword. I can basically get a Hokuto's Bow mark on an enemy, and nearby enemies will be affected by the mark and the bleed propagation. So I took that Blood Sword pretty much from prison quarters up until graveyard, and that was really, really cool. Next up, we have another melee weapon, which is the Torch. That actually drops from the spawners, which are found exclusively in the ossuary. Those are the big beaker guys that drop the corpse juices, the little worms that come up and bite you. So the Torch is dropped from them, and it's a really, really good weapon on its own merits because not only do you set enemies on fire when you hit them, it also applies fire stacks to the ground. So you can guess where this is going. You pair it with the Hokuto's Bow. You don't even need to pair it with the Hokuto's Bow, honestly. You can pair it with something that gives you oil, such as an oil grenade or something like that, and then you can get a lot of hits off. You can pair it with open wounds, get that 60% bleed, and you'll be able to get a lot of damage off. It's pretty nuts. And actually, same oil guide that I referred to earlier does talk about the Torch and oil, so definitely check that out. And yeah, so this is also a part of the dot build. Same thing as the Blood Sword, good on its own merit, but Torch is a good thing to take if you're on a dot build. So now we come to Freeze, and Freeze is not something that you would think of when you use dot builds, but on the other hand, Freeze can provide some pretty neat things. So there's a lot that comes with Freeze, and you really, really have to build around it if you're going to run a dot build. So there's 3 weapons that I'm thinking of, and that's the Ice Bow, the Frost Blast, and last but not least, the Ice Crossbow. And so, really, you're playing around with affixes when it comes to the freeze weapon. So, the first one is that enemies will bleed upon thawing. It's a very, very common affix. You can apply the Hokuto's bow, apply the freeze, and then you're set from there. The other thing you can do is also get something called frostbite. So, that's enemies that are slowed take damage. So, when enemies freeze, they will thaw, which means that they will be slowed for a good amount of time. So, if you hit them with the Hokuto's bow, and you pair that with frostbite, then you should be able to get some amount of damage off. While this isn't the most, what's the word? It's not the most optimal strategy in the entire world. It is something that you can do, especially if you're running like a colorless, or if you get like a legendary or cursed Hokuto's bow and you have like a freeze weapon. You can definitely try to run that out. It's not the greatest thing in the entire world, but again, it's a part of Dot. Last on our weapons list is the hemorrhage, and the hemorrhage is only found in the 5BC spoiler area, so for those of you who want to skip ahead, you can feel free to do so. I'll probably leave like a timestamp in the description so you can skip this part. I'll do the same thing when we get to shields as well. But the hemorrhage is a really good weapon that will inflict bleed when you throw it against an enemy. It doesn't pierce, but if you throw it against an enemy, it'll bleed, and if you hit them again, you'll get a critical hit. And with Dot builds, it's the same thing. Fire off the Hokuto's bow, fire the hemorrhage off, and then that bleed will actually end up killing the enemy most of the time because hemorrhage is actually very, very powerful. And the thing about hemorrhage, though, you got to remember is that it's a very, very slow weapon. So typically it's taken on survival builds. I do have a run with hemorrhage that I didn't do commentary on. It was a full run. You can actually watch it. I'll leave a link in the description or something like that so you can check that out. But yeah, so hemorrhage works pretty well with Dot, but again, it's just one of those weapons that unless you're in 5BC and have already unlocked it, you're probably not going to see it anytime soon. So let this serve as motivation to get to that 5BC mark, maybe with some Dot builds, maybe with something else, and you can unlock the hemorrhage and maybe try it out for yourself, see how it goes. So now we come to shields, and there are two shields that I have particularly in mind when it comes to Dot, and that is the Bloodthirsty shield and the Thunder shield. So I'll cover Bloodthirsty first. Bloodthirsty is a really good shield. It is honestly one of the best shields in the entire game, in my humble opinion. It is dropped from the shield bearers. There's very little chance, so you might want to use your Hunter's Instinct on them, or not Hunter's Instinct, the Hunter's Grenade, excuse me, on them. You can get the Bloodthirsty shield. It basically creates an area of effect for 3 seconds, and all nearby enemies will be inflicted with the blood. So you can fire off a Hokuto's bow, parry an enemy, and then you should be able to get that blood as well as the Hokuto's bow mark on that enemy. I do have a run. It was more of a gimmicky run where I just had a bunch of swarms, and I had the Bloodthirsty shield and the Hokuto's bow, and I actually did a lot of damage on a lot of different enemies, which was really cool. But yeah, so the Bloodthirsty, again, you get bleed, and then you can fire off the Hokuto's bow, you're set. The other one I'm thinking of is another 5BC shield, and that is the Thunder shield. And the Thunder shield, again, if you want to skip it, I'll leave a timestamp in the description so you can skip ahead. The Thunder shield, when you parry, you will have 65 electric DPS pretty much all around you. You're like a little static, little beheaded guy, and you're moving around, and if you fire off the Hokuto's bow, you get that electric DPS off on enemies. It's very powerful. You can additionally hold it down, and you can just hold it, and then you get like a small little electricity charge, kind of like a lightning bolt, but just like much less powerful. But again, with the Hokuto's bow, you actually end up getting a really cool type of damage, and it's very interesting because you can not only can you parry, not only can you get the electricity around you, not only can you hold it down, if you have the static running around you, if you press the Thunder Shield button again, you can actually stun all nearby enemies, and it does actually the most amount of damage out of all the other things. So again, fire out the Hokuto's bow, stun the enemy, you're set. The parry with the Thunder Shield will give you the electricity, and that actually works out really well for flying enemies such as kamikazes, buzz cutters, and bats, which are found in Promenade. So those are all really good. Again, Thunder Shield is a 5BC shield, so let this serve as motivation, again, to get to that 5BC mark and unlock the Hemorrhage and the Thunder Shield as well. You can also use it with pretty much any shield out there, but most shields are survival only. So either you get a legendary Hokuto's bow, or you get a colorless one, or you just run a colorless type of build. But be wary that that does, in fact, they disable achievements. So you want to be on the lookout for that. You can also pair it with the frontline shield, since that is part brutality. You can also pair it with the parry shield and the knockback shield. The thing about shields is that they actually will give you statuses. So you can get stuff like poisons the enemy on parry, burns the enemy on parry, bleeds the enemy on parry. So you can actually get that, which is really cool. And paired with the Hokuto's bow, you're set. Punishment is also really interesting, because punishment will basically, if you parry, all the nearby enemies will be affected by that parry. So you get some cool damage off on different enemies. If you mark them with the Hokuto's bow, you get that extra damage. But again, you might want to run a colorless build or a legendary Hokuto's bow for that one. There are so many amazing skills that you can use on dot builds, and I'm going to go through some of my favorites, and I'll mention some of the other ones in passing. So the first up is the Flame Turret, which I consider the best skill to take on a dot build. The Flame Turret will burn nearby enemies for 2 seconds, but the thing is, it has a good range, and it lasts for a good amount of time, and the fire it'll hit the enemy to their face and on the ground. And with dot, again, same thing as a torch, firebrands, fire blast, etc. Something you can also get is inflammable oil on the turret, and you can get something called generates a toxic cloud. So not only will you get inflammable oil, you'll get burn, so that doubles the burn stacks. You can also get poison damage off on enemies as well, which serves to be extremely useful, especially against bosses. The best thing about the flame turret is that it only has a cooldown of 6 seconds. So you have 6 seconds to dodge and to do whatever else you need to do. It's an excellent, excellent skill to have. Next up, we have the fire grenade, and this works very, very similarly to the flame turret. There's a couple key differences that you want to keep in mind. The first thing is that the fire grenade is pure brutality, so if you are running dot on brutality, which is generally how you run dot, you don't have to worry about getting a fire grenade that might be part tactics, or double tactics actually, if you have S tier items unlocked. So the fire grenade is really cool in that. The other thing about the fire grenade is that on high level gameplay such as 4 and 5 BC, you don't aggro enemies when you throw grenades on them. So what that ends up doing is you can actually just throw a fire grenade off to a different platform, and if the enemy doesn't see you, they're not going to end up having to deal with you. So again, pair it with the Hokuto's bow, you're set. Fire grenade is a staple on most brutality builds, as is the flame turret. So definitely fire grenade, which I believe is always unlocked. No, I'm sorry, they drop from the grenadiers, which you will find in prisoner quarters. Chances of you unlocking it pretty early is really, really high. So you should be able to get some nice damage off on enemies with the fire grenade. Not only that, but you can also get a nice 30% to burn on certain weapons as well. And the cooldown is fairly high at 13 seconds, so you just want to be a little bit mindful of that. Now we have the cleaver, which works extremely similarly to the flame turret. It has the same sort of affixes. You can get inflammable oil, so if you have a fire blast, pair it with the cleaver, you're set. You're pretty much set. You can also pretty much get the bleed, you can get the poison as well. You can get a lot of different things on the cleaver. Has good range. It will inflict a lot of bleed for a good amount of time, and you should be set pretty much just with the cleaver. I consider it one of the best skills in the entire game. It drops from the runner, which you can find in the promenade. I think they're exclusively in the promenade. Might be in a couple other biomes, but you get 50 DPS for 6 seconds, and I believe it gets damaged when the enemies walk all over it. But again, pair it with the Hokuto's bow. It's really, really useful on bosses. Honestly, extremely, extremely useful for bosses. Only bosses that don't really get affected by it is Giant, but even Giant, to an extent, can get affected by it if you manipulate the hands good enough. Conjunctivius can even get hit by it. The tentacles on Conjunctivius actually are very, very susceptible to Cleaver. So definitely recommend taking Cleaver with you. Next up is the Knife Dance, which actually drops from the Bat. Bat's found in the Promenade. You're going to unlock this pretty early. And a lot of people have this negative perception of Knife Dance because of the long cooldown and the fact that it's not very good on 0 BC. But once you hit higher level gameplay, including 1 and 2 BC, when you have the plus and plus plus items unlocked, you can get shots pierce the first target. You can get a lot of cool things with Knife Dance. And again, you just get that bleed off on enemies. And with the Hakuto's Bow, it becomes really good. You can also get bleed propagation, and bleeding causes poisoning, causing additional damage onto enemies. Now we have something called the Corrupted Power. And the Corrupted Power is a little bit subtle, so I'll try to explain this one to you guys. So it really is dependent on the affixes that you have for Corrupted Power, which could change in the 1.8 alpha. So it drops from the Protectors, which are the little shield dummies that can be found in a myriad of biomes, honestly. But they're most commonly found in the Promenade. So you get that, and basically what happens is that your damage increases for, I believe it is 8 seconds. Yes, it is 8 seconds. You get an additional base 50 DPS, but you also take additional damage during this period. So the Corrupted Power has a couple different affixes that you can play with, and I'll actually go over the ones in the 1.8 alpha, that the new ones for Corrupted Power. So the main ones I'm talking about are generating a toxic cloud around you, burning the ground, spreading inflammable oil, and the most important is the electricity. So when you get that electricity off on the Corrupted Power, with the Hakuto's Bow, you actually will get a lot of damage off. And also it deals really nicely with flying enemies such as bats, kamikazes, etc. So you can set off your Corrupted Power, just run through an entire maze and promenade and kill all the bats around. You can also get damage off on bosses, and if you have something like a Fire Blast or an Alchemic Carbine, you get additional damage with your Hakuto's Bow and your weapons as well. So Corrupted Power is definitely really good. And as for the 1.8 alpha, you get some new affixes such as bleeding nearby enemies when the effect is over. You get burning the ground when the effect is over onto nearby enemies. So those different affixes can work with the Hakuto's Bow, but I personally like the electricity the most, similar to the Thunder Shield. Very, very similar concept. Next up is the Corrosive Cloud, and this actually drops from the Purulent Zombie. The brown ones, they are found exclusively in the graveyard. There's also a green one that's found in Still and Toxic Sewers. But the Corrosive Cloud is a very basic type of skill. For 15 seconds, it creates a cloud that causes bleed and poison on an enemy. It's not the best skill in the entire world because it has an extremely long cooldown, but you can definitely use it in a dot build, especially with the Hakuto's Bow, and you don't have to worry about inflicting additional bleed. But I actually prefer having a cleaver, and especially when you have plus plus and S tier items unlocked, you can actually get the creates a toxic cloud around you sort of affix, and 100% to poison, things like that. So Corrosive Cloud actually pales in comparison compared to the cleaver. The only difference is that Toxic Cloud that inflicts bleed and poison lasts for a really, really, really long time. So Corrosive Cloud is okay, but not the greatest thing in the entire world. Now we have the Magnetic Grenade, which when I was thinking of doing this dot guide, I actually was not going to talk about the Magnetic Grenade, but after doing my full run with dot, I actually gained a lot of respect for Magnetic Grenade within dot builds. So the Magnetic Grenade is a very, very interesting shield. It drops again from the Grenadiers, so you'll probably be getting this pretty early on. It'll attract everything close to it and deal only 12 DPS for 5 seconds. But the thing is, that's 5 seconds, actually 5.5 seconds. So 12 DPS for 5.5 seconds is about 68 to 70 DPS, which is extremely good. And if you fire off a Hakuto's Bow, not only will you get additional damage to that DPS, you'll also be attracting all the nearby enemies. And this isn't just enemies on a given platform. This can be enemies above, so when the Hakuto's Bow hits those enemies, it'll also spread the mark to nearby enemies, and those could be attracted with the Magnetic Grenade, and you'll end up actually getting a lot of kills in a short amount of time. The other thing with the Magnetic Grenade is because it groups enemies together, you can actually get the Hakuto's Bow mark spread very, very, very quickly. And it does sneaky damage, like it really does. Especially if you pair it with like a fire grenade, you're pretty much set. Or if you have something like a fire blast or a torch or something like that, which you're using as your main weapon on dot builds, you actually end up attracting everything, and you pretty much just smoke enemies. Especially if you get inflammable oil on this, I would definitely keep an eye out for something like the Magnetic Grenade. Now we move on to the Sinew Slicer, and the Sinew Slicer is always unlocked. It's a very kind of polarizing type of turret, because I actually am a huge fan of it because of the fact that it does a lot of sneaky damage. You get 6 bleeding DPS that lasts for 1.5 seconds, and you get additional 20 damage like when you hit the targets. So you get about 26 DPS for 1.5 seconds. But it shoots for a good amount of time, and so paired with Hokuto's Bow on a tactics build, you can get some really quick kills off, and the base cooldown time is only 10 seconds, so you should be good to go from there. The last two are skills that I generally don't really use in dot builds, but I should probably mention them because they do kind of have that damage over time effect. So the first one is the Swarm, and the Swarm is pretty cool because the Swarm will drop a bunch of biters around you. They drop from the Disgusting Worm, which are found in the sewer levels. They're the big disgusting pink worms that drop the bombs after you kill them. So when you get the Swarm Grenade, you can summon up to 8 biters for 30 seconds. And if you fire off Hokuto's Bow, then you can summon your biters to go start killing enemies. I do have a build that I will link in the description that has a Bloodthirsty Shield and a Hokuto's Bow with the Swarm Grenades. It was okay. It worked out okay. Swarm is not the best grenade in the entire world. You're better off running like a fire grenade or a magnetic grenade or something like that. But there could be some uses for it. And the other one is the Wings of the Crow. The Wings of the Crow is not a very efficient skill at all. It's dropped from the Golem with a 1.7% chance. So the more you go to Sanctuary, the more you're going to be able to get that Wings of the Crow blueprint. So basically you float above all the enemies for 4 seconds, and you inflict 75 base DPS to the enemies below you, and that's a 24-second cooldown. And it is pure tactics. So if you are running a dot build on tactics, then you can definitely take Wings of the Crow, especially if you're killing like a mob of enemies, and you have the Hunter's Instinct unlocked, which we will get to mutation in a second. So Wings of the Crow could work, but it's not the greatest thing in the entire world. So as far as mutations are concerned, it really depends on the type of weapons that you have. So, for example, if I have a Hokuto's Bow and an Alchemic Carbine, I won't necessarily take something like Killer's Instinct or Open Wounds because I don't have any melee weapons on me. But if I have a Torch or a Blood Sword, I might consider those two options. So I'll split this into 2 categories, into Brutality and into Tactics. So with Brutality, Combo I think is one of the best skills or best mutations that you can get on a dot build, because that increases your base DPS for 8 seconds as soon as you kill an enemy. So when it comes to mob management, you fire off a Hokuto's Bow and then you kill an enemy, and then you can go and kill even more mobs, do more damage, and then you end up clearing out entire maps just with Combo by itself. Vengeance is another really cool ability because with dot builds, you're going to be focusing on that damage over time aspect, which means that you will probably have to either parry if you have a shield, or if you don't have a shield, then you will have to dodge. And I'm thinking, especially for boss battles such as Hand of the King, you're going to be focusing on dodging. But even the best players in the world in Death Cells don't have a 100% dodge rate. So with Vengeance, if you take a hit, then your base DPS increases for 8 seconds, and you get minus 60% damage taken for 3 seconds after taking a hit. This can also work if you're running tactics as well. So Vengeance is pretty interesting in that respect. Tainted Flask can also work if you are at the end of the game and you're kind of scared that, hey, like, I'm not so good against Hand of the King, or I'm not so good against Timekeeper, or I'm not so good against the 5BC final boss. Use Tainted Flask, because then you'll get a really nice health pot. You will increase your base DPS for 12 seconds, and in biomes, if you don't have any flasks, you kill base 12 elites, then you should be able to get a health flask. But the thing is, it'll actually cap at 4 at 28 plus Brutality. So if you're on 3 BC or so, and then you're in High Peak Castle, you can pretty much get those 4 elites. There's actually 4 elites, just base elites in High Peak Castle because of the doors, the green, blue, and red doors. But the other thing is there's also a couple elites scattered throughout. So you should be able to get your health flasks pretty much in order. Another one that I really like is Soldier's Resistance. And what Soldier's Resistance does is that it increases your base health, which is the main reason I actually take it. And at It'll cap off at 19 plus brutality at 25%. So 19 plus brutality you should be able to get in 1 BC onwards. Even 0 BC you can get 19 plus brutality. And so you get an increase in 25% for your health. The other thing with Soldier's Resistance is that on 4 and 5 BC you get something called melees. So with melees, basically if you get 10 stacks of melees, or 16 with dead inside, your health will pretty much go down to 10%. And you're forced to use a health pot. And health pot decreases melees counts by 60%. So the nice thing about Soldier's Resistance on 4 and 5 BC is that you can only be infected with the melees every 1.2 seconds, which means if you take a hit from like the knife thrower, for example, it'll hit you the one time and you'll get a melee stack. But the couple other times that it hits you, you won't get melees for that because it lasts for 1.2 seconds. So that's incredibly useful if you're worried about stuff like slashers, failed experiments, knife throwers, hand of the king, things like that, and you're kind of concerned about your melees. That actually works out really nicely. With tactics, it's a little bit of a different story. So Hunter's Instinct, I think, is the main thing that you want to take, because if you have a Hokuto's Bow, which is generally how these dot builds go, Hunter's Instinct will basically get your skills back almost immediately, because it is up to 3 seconds for each enemy killed without using close combat attacks, which basically means ranged attacks. So if you have a Hokuto's Bow and a Fire Blast, for example, all you need to do is just hit the enemy with the Hokuto's Bow, and you'll get your skills back extremely quickly. Support is really good in that if you have like a flame turret or a cleaver or something like that, you get increased damage. Sinew Slicer, it's the same thing. This only works with the turrets though, because you have to be nearby the skill. Parting Gift also works because it drops a bomb, and if there's like nearby mobs and stuff like that, you kill one enemy with whatever weapon that you have. Hokuto's Bow, bomb drops, pretty much will kill all the enemies around it. Tranquility will work if you are running something like a Alchemic Carbine and want to shoot enemies from far away. You get more base DPS. Other things that could also work is something like the Crow's Foot. So Hokuto's Bow, Crow's Foot slows the enemy down and also will give you a little extra damage. So just things like that you want to keep in mind. Even something like Tactical Retreat, which I'm personally not a big fan of. You can actually slow by nearby enemies, get some additional hits off, but I generally like to take Crow's Foot over Tactical Retreat. Other things that could also potentially work are stuff like Blind Faith if you are running a shield, ammo if you are worried about your ammo count with certain weapons. I don't think it works with the Hokuto's Bow though. YOLO if you are scared about dying. Recovery kind of sort of works just depending on the weapon that you're running. If you're running a melee weapon like the Torch or the Blood Sword, it could work nicely with that. Emergency Triage is great for endgame. Dead Inside if you're at endgame. Acceptance and Alienation could also work if you are worried about melees or if you want to reduce the amount of curses that you have. Masochist, especially if you're on tactics build, always take that. And Disengagement, if you fall under 20%, then you become shielded for 5 seconds. You can take that opportunity to use a health pot or something like that. So those are just mutations in a nutshell. So that is going to be it for me. Dot is one of those very, very interesting playstyles that you may not think of immediately when it comes to the best builds in the game, but I consider it to be extremely, extremely powerful. Just because you're not doing damage to an enemy straight to its face, it doesn't mean that you're not going to be doing damage at all. You can utilize the skills and the different weapons you have, and especially with the Hokuto's Bow, you actually end up doing a lot of damage. And honestly, you end up doing more damage a lot of the time than other weapons. So something else that I wanted to note before I signed off was if you compare Hokuto's Bow with pretty much any tactics or brutality weapon, just because you get that extra mark on that enemy. If you don't want to run a shield, you can just use a Hokuto's Bow instead. And especially on brutality, if you pair it with something like open wounds, that in itself with a melee weapon will count as damage over time, technically. But Hokuto's Bow is pretty much the central part of damage over time, so make sure you unlock that if you really want to succeed in damage over time. Thank you guys so much for joining me. It means a lot that you guys would take time out of your day and just time out of watching other YouTube creators to watch my stuff. I really, really appreciate that. I have other stuff coming on the way. I am working on the third part of the Shield Guide. I know I've been saying that for a little bit, but it is very long. It's got a lot of different elements to it. It's going to be basically how to parry every single enemy. I have collaborated with a really cool Twitch streamer. His name is KingDKC. That is KingDKC. Follow him on Twitch. Follow two other people that I wanted to mention, Bahoa, BOHOA, and HyperStypherX, HYPERSTIPHERX. Follow those three people on Twitch. They are quality people, and they have been very, very helpful in helping me get subscribers and helping me make more content. And again, I just want to thank you guys for joining me. I'll see you guys in the next video. Have a great night, everybody.
One day I woke up, I didn't have shit. I had to work hard just to grab this. Blue faces stacked up, that's my fetish. I'm ready for these bandits. They said I wouldn't make it, who asked you? I got brought into this life I didn't ask to. I'ma make most of it all cause I had to. You get money from your mama, I chase it because I had to.